Lecture 2, The Life of the Buddha.
When someone encounters Buddhism for the first time, when you come as we do as students to this tradition, beginning to ask some basic questions about the study of Buddhism, the most natural question to ask is simply, who was the Buddha? Who was that man? Who was the person who set this incredibly rich and complex religious tradition in motion? And if you're at all curious about the impact that this person had on the lives of the people in India, where he was born, and in all the other countries in Asia, including modern America, where Buddhism has become an important part of the religious landscape, it's also natural to ask another question. How did the life story of this person, the person we call the Buddha, become so deeply woven into the lives of the people who call themselves Buddhists? In our second lecture, I'd like to do two things. I'd like to tell you the story of the Buddha's life, and also reflect about the way that story has been mirrored in the lives of Buddhist people throughout Asia and today in our own communities in North America. Historically, we have just a couple of facts about the life of the Buddha. We know, or we think we know, that he was born in the family of King Shuddhodana and Queen Maya about the year 566 BC in a region of the Indian subcontinent that now lies in what we would call southern Nepal. This date of 566 BCE has been questioned recently by historians who place his birth a little bit later in the 5th century. So I suppose we have to recognize right at the very beginning that there's a little bit of uncertainty about the Buddha's date, perhaps give or take about 50 years. This young man was a member of the Shakya tribe. His clan name was Gautama, and his given name was Siddhartha, which means something like goal achieved or mission accomplished. It's been common in the Buddhist world to refer to him as Siddhartha Gautama, or even more commonly as Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakya clan. Now, this handful of historical facts is actually important to us. They tell us that the Buddha is not a figment of someone's imagination. He was a real human being who walked the dusty roads of northern India about 2,500 years ago, at a time when India, like many other important regions around the world, was going through an important process of religious ferment. But these historical facts don't tell us very much about what the Buddha did or about what he has meant to his followers in the Buddhist tradition. To learn about the Buddha this way, we have to turn to stories Buddhists tell about the Buddha and learn to look at the Buddha through Buddhist eyes. To tell the story of the Buddha the way Buddhists tell it, we have to begin not with his birth, but with his previous births. The Buddhist tradition arose at a time when the doctrine of reincarnation was a basic assumption of Indian religious life. People assumed that human beings did not live just one life and then go on to some kind of reckoning in an afterlife. They cycled around again and again in a continuous process of death and rebirth. This process was called in ancient India samsara, which is, I'm happy to say, not to be confused with the perfume of the same name. Samsara is the name we give to the cycle of death and rebirth in classical India. The word samsara means to wander from one life to the next, potentially without end. Now you might ask yourselves, as students of comparative religion, as I talk about the doctrine of samsara and about the life of the Buddha, how would you feel about the prospect of an endless cycle of life in this world, or possibly even in worlds that are not as pleasant as this one. In India, serious religious people began to think that samsara was not a particularly appealing idea. To my classes in Boston, where I teach about the doctrine of samsara, usually at the end of the summer, September, early October, I say that the best way to recreate this feeling for themselves is to imagine that they are born again as Red Sox fans. Now, my apologies to any of you who may be devoted Red Sox fans and don't like the drift of this analogy, but part of the lore of living in Boston is the constant cycle of raising hopes that perhaps this will be the year when the magnificent event of a World Series victory may finally come to Boston. And, of course, for one reason or another, as happens not just in Boston but elsewhere in America too, these hopes seem inevitably to be dashed. Well, that feeling of disappointment, and disappointment that comes in a continuous cycle of hopes raised and hopes dashed, is a bit like feeling that's associated with the doctrine of samsara. Samsara brings you back into this world with many possibilities and many hopes and dreams, but they're hopes and dreams that lead eventually to frustration, to death, and to rebirth again in another life. So the great sages of India, like the Buddha and other sages in other religious traditions in India too, attempted to find a way out of the cycle of samsara. The idea was not to come back into this world and enjoy its pleasures once again, but to find a way to bring the cycle of samsara to a definitive conclusion. People assumed in India that someone as important as the Buddha must have prepared for this possibility through an enormous number of previous lives, by studying under previous Buddhas and practicing all the virtues that would come to such glorious fruition in his final life as the Buddha Shakyamuni. Now, the stories of the Buddha's previous lives are told in a body of texts that are known today as the Jataka, or the birth tales. In their English translation, they occupy a number of hefty volumes, so they would be a significant body of material if I lined them up in front of me here on my lectern. Many of them are quite simple, almost childlike, and they sound best if they could be told with the lilting cadences of a child. I may not be able to recreate the right kind of childlike voice myself, but you can imagine what your favorite 7-year-old would sound like if he were telling the following story about a previous life of the Buddha. Once upon a time, there were 3 animals, a monkey, an elephant, and a partridge, and they began to discuss which one of them was the oldest. The oldest was the one who would be deserving of special respect. The elephant pointed to a gigantic fig tree, and as you may know, the fig trees in South Asia are enormous. They're almost the size of cathedrals sometimes. And the elephant pointed to one of these massive trees and said, "Well, I'm so old. I'm such an old elephant that when I was little, I could walk across this tree, walk over this tree, and its leaves would barely touch my belly." And the monkey said, "Well, you may be pretty old, but when I was a little monkey, I could reach up and pluck leaves from the topmost branches of that tree. That's how old I am compared to this tree." And the partridge said that when he was young, he ate a seed. The seed passed through his body, fell to the ground, and grew up to become the tree. So the elephant and the monkey bowed down and paid homage to the partridge. The Jataka tale ends, like other Jataka tales, with the common formula in the words of the Buddha, in the mouth of the Buddha, "And I, the Buddha, was that partridge." Technically, the being who appeared as that partridge was not actually the Buddha himself. He didn't become the Buddha until the life when he was born as Siddhartha Gautama. Buddhists refer to the partridge as a bodhisattva, or a Buddha to be, We could also call a bodhisattva a future Buddha, someone who is on the way to Buddhahood in some future life. And we'll see that Buddhists, in one way or another, whether they're little children telling a story about respect for elders, or the most sophisticated monks and nuns, have to grapple with what it means for themselves to be bodhisattvas, people on the way to achieving Buddhahood in some future life. So these Jataka tales teach moral lessons for everybody, not just for the people who expect to be Buddhas, as Siddhartha Gautama himself was in this life. Now, when Siddhartha Gautama's career as a bodhisattva was near its end, he was born as the son of Shuddhodana and Maya. As you can imagine, the story of his birth is full of miraculous signs. According to tradition, the future Buddha sprang from his mother's side, took 7 steps to the north, and announced in a commanding voice, "I am the best of the world. This is my last birth, and I will never be born again." Now, that's rather unusual. It was rather unusual even for ancient India for an event like that to take place, and it got the attention of his father, as you might well imagine. So he called in the court sages and asked them to explain what these miraculous events actually meant. They saw that there were wheels inscribed on the palms of Siddhartha's hands and on the soles of his feet, and they told his father that the child was destined to become a Chakravartin, or a turner of the wheel. The wheels could mean either that he would turn the wheel of conquest around India and become a great king, or he could turn the wheel of religious teaching and become a great sage. Either way, the wheel was the symbol of his status as a so-called Mahapurusha, a great person. The 8-spoked wheel of the Buddha's teaching is still used as a symbol of Buddhism on temples and in Buddhist sculpture today. Siddhartha's father tried to protect him from the suffering of the world in the hope that he would not choose what must have seemed to him to be the rather disreputable and unpleasant option of becoming a religious sage. For a while, according to the story, he was successful. Siddhartha was married, he had a child, and he seemed to be content with his sheltered life in the palace. But one day he was riding in a park outside the palace, and he saw 4 sights: a sick person, an old person, a corpse, and a wandering ascetic. According to the story, he was shocked by this vision of suffering. This came to him as something that he had simply not seen before, wasn't aware of in some emotional sense, and it shocked him. It stopped him in his tracks, and he decided to leave the palace to become an ascetic himself. His process of leaving the palace, of shaving his head, of giving away all of his possessions, and taking up the robe and the begging bowl of a wandering monk, is another crucial event in the life of traditional Buddhists. It functions in many of the Buddhist countries of Southeast Asia as a coming-of-age ceremony, and it's reenacted whenever a child or a young person or an older person leaves ordinary life to become a monk or a nun. As a monk, Siddhartha did not immediately find much success, again according to the legends that are told about his life in Buddhist tradition. He joined a group of other ascetics and tried to confront the problems of old age and death by starving himself until he was nothing but skin and bones. There are some extraordinarily powerful Buddhist images of this phase in his life that show him with his eyes sunk deep in their sockets and veins standing out over the bones on his rib cage. It wasn't a particularly pleasant time for him, and it didn't bring him the results he wanted. So he accepted a bowl of rice pudding from a young woman and withdrew into the style of life that Buddhists call middle path. Now, The concept of the middle path is another one of these key ideas that grows right out of the legendary telling of the story of the Buddha, and it colors every aspect of Buddhist life. The point is to avoid two extremes: the extreme of self-denial, like the self-denial that Siddhartha experienced when he almost starved himself to death, and the extreme of self-indulgence. And these extremes apply not just to the way people live, as was true in the story about Siddhartha, but also to the way they think, especially to the way they think about themselves. Buddhist philosophers constantly ask, what do we mean when we use the word self? And while they disagree exactly about the way they should formulate the answer to that question, the answers always involve the avoidance of two extremes. You can't affirm the self too much, attribute too much permanent identity to it, and you also can't deny it too much, because it needs to be taken seriously in order to pursue the religious life that someone like the Buddha was attempting to follow. Now, once Siddhartha found the middle path, things began to move more quickly for him. He sat down under the tree that became known eventually as the Bodhi tree, the tree of his awakening, and he fixed himself in meditation. He was tempted by Mara, who in Buddhist tradition is the personification of death, and who first sent his daughters to seduce him and then sent his sons as an army to attack him. Usually people think that these armies are meant to scare Siddhartha and make him give up meditation out of fear, and I suppose that's the obvious interpretation of this story, but I think it's also fun every once in a while to just imagine a rather different scenario than the one that is traditionally presented. I sometimes think of these armies as being the vision of those young men who must have been the cronies, the friends of Siddhartha before he left the palace, left his life as a prince and took up the life of a religious teacher, saying to him, "Come on, Siddhartha, come on out and fight with us one more time. Just join our princely existence and fill yourself with that great rush of aggression that makes a princely life so satisfying and so full of energy." In any case, however you interpret it, whether you follow my fanciful interpretation or something that's a little bit more traditional, the Buddha, or the future Buddha, Siddhartha, resisted these temptations, and Mara was defeated. You may perhaps know, if you know the tradition of Buddhist sculpture, that this is one of the most important iconic gestures for the statues of the Buddha. He's often shown in a gesture that is called the Bhumi Sparsha gesture, the earth-touching gesture, in which he reaches down, touches the earth, and the earth shakes to bear witness to the solidity of his meditation and of his resolve to defeat the forces of death and rebirth. Now, once Mara had been defeated in the dark of the night, Siddhartha passed through several stages of meditation and finally understood what caused the suffering of the world and how he could bring it to a definitive end. This is the moment when we can properly call Siddhartha the Buddha, or the Awakened One. Now, you may have heard this word translated as the Enlightened One. This is very common. It's common to speak about this moment in the Buddha's career as the moment of his enlightenment. But this is a misleading translation, I believe. Buddhists say that a Buddha is someone who has awakened from the dream of ignorance and whose wisdom has blossomed like a flower. These days, we translate the word Buddha as the Awakened One, and I suppose it also would be fine to say that he's the one who has blossomed, but that just doesn't sound quite right in English, so we stick with the translation of this event as his awakening. When Siddhartha became a Buddha, he also achieved the state or the goal that Buddhists call nirvana. There's a lot of confusion about nirvana, too. And Buddhists don't make it any easier when they insist that only a Buddha can really know what nirvana is. For the rest of us, it may be enough simply to know what the word nirvana really means. Nirvana means to extinguish or to blow out, like blowing out the flame of a candle. A Buddha is someone who not only has understood the causes of suffering, but he has extinguished them. He no longer suffers from the ignorance and desire that feed the fire of death and rebirth. Tradition tells us that the Buddha was tempted to stay under the tree of his awakening and enjoy this experience of nirvana for himself. But instead he got up and he walked to Sarnath, a suburb that's on the outskirts of the city of Benares, the great Hindu pilgrimage site on the bank of the Ganges River. And he taught about his awakening to a group of ascetics. This event is called in Buddhist tradition the first turning of the wheel of the law. And it represents the beginning of Buddhist tradition. So it's represented, of course, in Buddhist sculpture and Buddhist iconography with this wheel that was found also on the soles of the Buddha's feet and on the palms of his hands. From this point on, the Buddha had a long and fruitful career, walking the roads of northern India, teaching to kings and peasants and merchants, converting monks and nuns, and presiding over what became eventually a thriving monastic order. There are many wonderful stories about this phase in the Buddha's life, as you might well imagine. I said a few minutes ago that the Jataka tales would themselves occupy a large space on a bookshelf. That's even more true about the stories that are told about the Buddha's life. And I suppose each of us who studies Buddhism has a particular favorite for its strange combination of psychological vividness and a dose of the miraculous. The story that appeals most to me is the story of a figure by the name of Angulimala, whose name means simply garland of fingers. It also has a heavy dose, I would have to say, of the bizarre. It's a very strange story, but it's one that tells quite a bit, I think, about the style of Buddhist tradition and perhaps indeed even about the style of the Buddha's own teaching. When the story starts, Angulimala is a pious student, a classic A student. Occasionally we encounter them, even in our own courses. Eager to please his demanding teacher, and his classmates became so jealous about Angulimala's achievements that they told some scandalous stories about Angulimala and provoked the teacher to try to seek revenge against him. So Angulimala went to his teacher and he asked how much he needed to pay for his final teaching. He really wanted to pay his teacher his final fee, and the teacher said, "Your final fee, Angulimala, is to go out into the forest and bring me the severed fingers of 100 people whom you have killed yourself." That was the fee. Very strange. And Angulimala, devoted student that he was, went out into the forest and attempted to follow his teacher's instructions. The word got around that this was going on. The king sent out a punitive expedition to capture Angulimala and bring him to justice. And Angulimala's mother heard that the king's soldiers were chasing Angulimala, so she decided to go out and warn Angulimala so he could get away. By this time, the Buddha realized that Angulimala was so far gone that he would kill even his own mother to seize her fingers. So the Buddha went out to intercede. And then the story becomes interesting. The Buddha is walking slowly through the forest, and Angulimala comes running after him, saying, "Stop, stop, I want your fingers." The Buddha doesn't seem to be moving very fast, and yet no matter how fast Angulimala runs, the Buddha slips away from him. Angulimala says, "Stop, stop, you bald-headed old monk. Stop so that I can get your fingers." And the Buddha turns around and says, "Angulimala, I have stopped. Why don't you stop?" And Angulimala says, "You haven't stopped. No matter how hard I run, you keep getting away from me." And the Buddha says, "I have stopped all the causes of death and rebirth. Angulimala, why don't you stop?" And at this point, Angulimala turns back into the student that he once was. And he throws himself down at the feet of the Buddha and in tears asks for his forgiveness and asks to be made a member of the monastic community. The Buddha initiates him into the monastery and makes him a monk. It turns out, of course, that it's not quite so easy in Buddhist society to make such a radical change. When Angulimala went around and begged at the door of the villages at the doors in the villages where he once had been such a terrifying presence, it wasn't a particularly easy thing for him to do, and he eventually had to go through some very severe penances before he could finally come to realize the significance of the Buddha's teaching. But eventually he became one of the greatest monks of the tradition and an extraordinary example of a radical change in life that comes from seeing himself in a different way and renouncing all that he was to become a new person on the path to nirvana. Another teaching tale that had tremendous significance in China and Japan is the story of Kashyapa. One day, according to this story, the Buddha was meeting with a group of monks, and instead of speaking to them, he held up a flower. Everyone in the group except for Kashyapa waited for an explanation. Kashyapa just smiled. And the Buddha said, "There is a supreme teaching. Words cannot reach it, and this supreme teaching I have just handed to Kashyapa." Both these stories show us something about the Buddha and also something about the way Buddhist tradition has imagined this remarkable and important figure. Words have their place in Buddhism, but the Buddha's teaching can be conveyed just as well through gestures, through a smile, through a tilt of the head, or perhaps best of all, through silence. The reason is that it's not just a teaching about words and concepts. It's a teaching about the way to live a serene and contemplative life. And the Buddha taught this as much by his example as by his words. At about the age of 80, the Buddha's teaching career finally came to an end. He gave his last teaching to the monks and lay down between two trees and passed gently from this life, never to be born again. Buddhists call this event his parinirvana, his complete nirvana, the fulfillment of everything he had set out to accomplish when he saw the four sights in the park outside his palace. Now, I said earlier that the Buddha's life did not begin with his birth. It's also true to say that his life did not end with his death. Before he died, he told his disciples to take his body and cremate it, as they would cremate the body of a great king, and then to set up the relics of his cremation in large, round shrines that were called stupa mounds. We could call them reliquary mounds, the mounds that would be used to house the relics of a great saint. And here people could come and pay homage to the Buddha as if he were still alive, even though he had passed on into his parinirvana and had ceased to be part of the cycle of death and rebirth. Now, there's much more that we could say about the Buddha's life. The traditions go on in a much more rich way than I've been able to do more than suggest in just these few stories. But you can see a few things from what I've said about the Buddha. You can see a few things that are important about the Buddha himself and also about the tradition that he helped set in motion. First of all, the Buddha was a human being. He was not a god, nor was he a manifestation of God. He was a human being who tried to confront the fundamental problems of suffering and death and bring them to a solution. He also did this in a tradition of Indian asceticism that had broad impact throughout the religious traditions of India. And he did it in a way that had extraordinary impact on the rest of the religious life of Asia. An impact that we will have a chance to explore much more deeply in the lectures that lie ahead.